Thank you for coming. I am very impressed by this arrangement. Tonight I'm going to talk to you about involuntary autobiographical memories. And let me start by saying that autobiographical memories are memories about events in our personal past. I'm particularly interested in such memories when they come to mind unbidden. That is, when we get them without expecting to have them. And that's why I have put Marcel Proust, the French author Marcel Proust, on the front slide here, because he describes such memories in his famous autobiographical novel, Remembrance of Things Past. But I will start by providing you with a more everyday example of an involuntary autobiographical memory. This person first describes the situation she is in when a memory comes to mind. She explains, "I was running in the botanical garden while thinking of something I had just read for my psychology class. It was a beautiful spring day with birdsong and not many people out. I ran per routine and suddenly got a side stitch, which is unusual for me. And then a memory pops up. I then remembered a day on a trip where I was running with my friend from England. I got a severe side stitch, and he had, through his years in the military, learned some breathing techniques against side stitches, which he then taught me." So I'm sure you can see that there are some similarities between the situation she is in when the memory comes to her mind and the content of the memory. The most salient similarity is the side stitch, but also the fact that she's running in both situations. So it's a lot of similarities that seem to have facilitated this sudden occurrence of the memory. And that's something I will talk more about today. Operationally, we define involuntary memories simply as a memory of a past event that comes to mind with no attempts of retrieval, at least no immediately preceding attempts. Subjectively, the memory unexpectedly pops up in our minds, and the contrast conceptually to this phenomenon are voluntary autobiographical memories, that is, memories, again, of personal events that we retrieve in a controlled and goal-directed fashion, such as when we start speculating about what did I do last Saturday, or when did somebody introduce this person to me, and we try to search for a memory. That's voluntary memories. So we have two different ways we can access our autobiographical memory base, all the experiences we have stored from our personal life. One is this involuntary access route, which is my main interest, where it happens unintentionally, automatically. And the other is this voluntary strategy where we search voluntarily and try to arrive at a memory. Now, you may be surprised to hear this, but in psychology, which is my field, and on other fields as well, the focus in research has been on that side of the slide, so to speak. Most studies on memories for past events and memory in general have focused on memories that are strategically recalled, whereas involuntary memories, involuntary but conscious memories, were long ignored in psychology. And I can back that up by a few quotes from some famous psychologists. Some of you may know Endel Tolvin, who introduced the notion of episodic memory, at least some of you who have studied psychology. Very famous Canadian psychology professor, who in this great book, it is, says access to or actualization of information in the episodic system, which is autobiographical memory, tends to be deliberate and usually requires conscious effort. And then he says another place, few things that we perceive make us think of previous happenings in our own lives. Many stimuli that could potentially serve as reminders or cues, even if they are prominently displayed to the person, will not have such effect. So, in this view, he says that involuntary memories are very rare. Now, that was many years ago. More recently, Davachi and Dobbins write, they acknowledge that occasionally a memory will just pop into one's head wholly uninvited. although we have all had such involuntary recollections, they are arguably not the norm. Well, as a consequence of that view, where involuntary memories were sort of defined out, excluded from research, one might say, they were involuntary, episodic is the same word as autobiographical, don't worry about it, it's about past events. Involuntary episodic remembering were for a long time limited to clinical settings and clinical theories. In other words, they were viewed as a symptom of distress, as a sign that something had gone wrong. That if a person had involuntary memories, there was some psychopathological symptoms, or at least some traumatic events. Now, 20 years ago, God bless me, I started studying this phenomenon. This is a paper from my PhD project, which actually came out in 1996 when Bill Clinton was the president in the US. And where I conducted a study of involuntary memories, autobiographical memories in daily life, and found that they were in fact very common. Now, therefore, now 20 years later, I have studied this from many different perspectives, through many different methods. And I want to introduce the alternative view to this view that they are a symptom of distress and that they are rare. My view is that involuntary autobiographical memories are really a basic mode of remembering, and we probably could not survive without it. And what do I mean by a basic mode? Well, I mean that they are universal in the sense that if you have an intact autobiographical, or if you like episodic, memory system, if you are able to remember past events, then you will also experience having these involuntary, spontaneously arising memories. They are frequent in daily life. I'll show you some evidence for that in a little bit. They operate on the same underlying episodic memory system as do voluntary memories, the controlled memories. They access the same pool of memories. I think the involuntary memories are evolutionarily earlier because they involve less of what we call executive control or executive functions. That's higher order cognitive processes located in the front of our brains, prefrontal cortex. We also have some evidence for that with great apes. And they are functional. They serve important functions in daily life, but they can become dysfunctional. The clinicians, clinical psychologists and psychiatrists were right that they can sometimes be a symptom of distress, but that's not the norm. So what I'm going to talk about for the rest of my talk is sort of back up that view. First, I'm going to talk about what we have figured out about characteristics of these memories. How frequent are they? And what kind of contents come to mind? Are they negative? Are they positive? And do they differ from memories we retrieve voluntarily? Then I'm going to address maybe the most intriguing phenomenon. How on earth do they come to mind? What happens? Why don't we get them all the time? And then I'm going to elaborate on a view I have introduced, which is that they provide some sort of shortcut to the personal past. They are easier to access than voluntary memories, and that may be helpful for people who have difficulties with these executive control processes. So that's the outline. Okay, so let's look at the frequency first. So in spite of the fact that a lot of researchers had claimed that these memories are really rare and voluntary event memories are really the norm, nobody had actually bothered to look. And then until a postdoc in my center, Anne Rasmussen, got the idea to actually study this and came up with a method she could use. In this study, we had a total of 48 participants. They were divided into two groups with 24 in each. And one group had the job, got the task to record their involuntary autobiographical memories during a normal day. And they were, of course, carefully instructed about what we meant by this notion. And the other group were instructed to record their voluntary autobiographical memories, that is, memories they really tried to remember, again during a normal day. And all the participants were equipped with a little mechanical counter, a little thing they could have in their pocket, where they pressed the button each time they noticed an involuntary or a voluntary memory, depending on which group they were assigned to. And then we counted by the end of the day. And what we found was quite surprising to even us. We found that the involuntary memories, the bright bar here, were substantially more frequent than the voluntary memories. Now remember that these are memories for events in our past. It's not all kinds of memories we are talking about here. And what this shows is that when we remember events in our past, personal experiences we have had, that happens apparently more frequently in terms of these involuntary recollections than trying to actively remember a past event. I'm not claiming it's the same for telephone numbers or facts, but for personal events, involuntary memories, actually, an involuntary recall seems to be the most common way of accessing the past. We have done other studies also where one can see that if we vary the way we were doing the recording, then we can vary these frequency estimates, but still the basic conclusion is that involuntary memories are at least as frequent as these voluntary memories. So they are as common in daily life as the voluntary memories, and probably even more common. Okay, what about content? Are they more negative or more positive than the voluntary memories? Well, in order to figure that kind of questions out, this was actually the first study I conducted. Then we used what we call a structured diary method. That's a method one can use if one wants to study everyday life phenomena as they show up in real life context. So in this case, the structured diary method consists of two parts for the involuntary memories. Because it is clear that these memories have to be recorded immediately when they come to mind, otherwise they are rapidly forgotten. People carry a small notebook or an electronic, it could also be a cell phone or some sort of recording device, in which they answer a fixed set of questions every time they have an involuntary memory. And I usually limit people to 2 per day when we're interested in looking at characteristics and content, in order to avoid people from generating memories. So immediately when they have a memory, they take up their notebook or their phone or whatever we use and answer these fixed set of questions, and it only takes 2 minutes. It's something they can easily do while they are in the bus or attending a lecture or whatever they're doing. Then later the same day, when they have more time, they answer a more extensive questionnaire based on the notes they have made in the notebook. And then, in order to have a comparison, they remove a sticker and see a word, and then they are asked to retrieve voluntarily a memory in association with that word, so that we can compare these involuntary memories with memories retrieved voluntarily. And of course they answer the same kind of questions for both types of memories. Now, I won't drag you through all these diary studies we've conducted, but we just sum up the main findings. We have seen a lot of similarities between these two types of memories. Both types of memories show a dominance of positive events. People remember many more positive events in their lives, if they are not depressed, than negative events. They also show the same forgetting rate. We tend to remember things that has happened recently much more frequently than things that we have experienced several years ago. And the curve sort of is similar for both types of memories. There's also a dominance of visual imagery for both types of memories. So they're not that different. Let me just back up this claim that they are predominantly positive. Here you can see in 2 studies, these refer to 2 different studies. But you can see the pattern is very similar. These are the red ones are the involuntary, the blue ones are the voluntary. And you can see that there's a dominance of positive memories for both types of memories, no matter whether you retrieve them involuntarily or voluntarily. And that is important in relation to these claims that were earlier on that involuntary memories are really a sign of distress. No, they are not. They are just as positive as voluntary memories. Now, aren't there any differences between these two types of memories? Because if there weren't, it wouldn't be so interesting. Well, but there are differences. Involuntary memories are the kind of memories that are more likely to make you laugh or cry or give you butterflies in your stomach. Involuntary memories have more mood impact when they come to mind and more physical reaction. Some clinical psychologists call that flashback quality. It's like we are being transported more back in time when we have involuntary memories compared to voluntary autobiographical memories. And the involuntary memories also more frequently refer to very specific events. That is, memories about a specific moment in the past, a very specific situation in the past that we can say happened at a particular time and place. So not just any memory of my grandmother, but a particular situation with my grandmother. So let me give you just a little examples of this finding of more mood impact and physical reaction, more flashback quality for involuntary memories. Here's an example of a negative memory that comes with such flashback quality. The participant, when she gets the memory, is a passenger in a car, and she's sitting in the car thinking the driver, which is her boyfriend, goes much too fast, and then the memory pops up. She remembers, once a young guy crashed into the back of my car on the very same highway. And she thinks this is a highly vivid memory, and she says, she claims, she rates that it has a negative mood impact, and it makes her shiver, make me shiver. The same can happen if it's a positive memory. Here's an example of a positive flashback. A young man who is talking about the coming summer vacation when the memory pops up. Then he says, I remember myself in the water on a surfboard in Australia right in that moment when the wave catches the board. Right in that moment when the wave catches the board. It's a highly vivid memory. It gives him a positive mood impact, and he has a physical reaction. My chest raised and I got butterflies in my stomach. Involuntary memories more frequently have this kind of reaction. When we look through a number of studies we've conducted, I don't think this is the complete list, you can see that compared to voluntary memories across these studies, involuntary memories have more of this mood impact. And I think the next slide is about physical reaction, where we can see also that when there is a difference between involuntary and voluntary memories, it is the involuntary memories that have more physical reaction. And I think we have conducted some more recent studies showing the same pattern. Now, what about this I just mentioned, that involuntary memories are more specific? Well, a specific event, here's an example. A specific event could be one particular time in North Carolina, this is actually my own memory, when I found a piece of metal in my soup in a Thai restaurant when we were having lunch there. That's a very specific memory. It refers to a particular situation. And in contrast to that, a non-specific memory, a general event we call it, is what normally happens when I eat in a Thai restaurant with my friend. Remembering such specific events are actually something that develops quite late in childhood. It's something that requires quite a lot. Therefore, it's intriguing that when we compare involuntary memories to voluntary memories, they are typically found to have a higher frequency of such specific memories. You can see across these studies, with a few exceptions, involuntary memories are more specific than voluntary memories. So that leads us to the next question I want to address. How do they come to mind? Well, again, we know from diary studies, these naturalistic studies, that, and also as in the example I showed you in the beginning, that involuntary memories are cued, which means that they are facilitated by some feature overlap between the current situation and the past event, such as the side stitch example I gave you in the beginning. In the great majority of cases, people are capable of identifying such overlapping features. And we have also found that these triggers are most frequently features of the external environment, such as people or places, objects, sensory experiences, and so forth, rather than internal thoughts and emotions. So this retrieval process is very much driven by random things in our environment. Okay, but that leaves us with a critical question. If such cues as triggers in the environment are all that matters, why aren't we constantly flooded by involuntary autobiographical memories? Every moment is filled with potential cues. The shoes you're wearing, people sitting next to you, your hands and so forth, all of this were part of previous situations. Why do these memories not constantly come to you? And we have to say, well, that must be because some cues are better than other cues, and some cues just don't work at all. But how can we decide, how can we figure out why some cues are better than other cues? Disentangling this issue required more controlled experiments than these diary studies. So we had to move, so to speak, from the field, take what we have learned from the field studies and move to the lab in order to figure out these things. Now, one notion or one conception that helped us build an experiment to examine this is the notion of cue item discriminability, which simply refers to how easily a given cue isolates an item. Let me try to unpack that. If you have seen such a weird instrument or heard such a weird instrument, a rare instrument once in your past, hearing it again is a strong cue for that past situation. Whereas an instrument you can associate with many past experiences, such as a harmonica, is a weak cue because it is associated with too many things to activate any of them. They become a mess, they become a blur, there's a lot of interference going on, and the cue is simply not, suffers from overload. It's overloaded with associations and therefore is inefficient in relation to any of these events, especially if there's a lot more than 3. So that's why you don't constantly get involuntary memories in response to your shoes, because they are associated with too many situations in the past. That's the theoretical starting point we had. Now, in order to see if that was right, we conducted an experiment. We dreamed up a paradigm where we used sounds. We used sounds as cues and scenes as something people should remember. So in our first phase, which is the learning phase, we presented scenes together with sounds. So people were sitting in front of a computer and they heard sounds and saw a picture of a scene, for example, a scene with trees. And then in phase 2, we used these sounds as cues for involuntary and voluntary retrieval. We did not, let me just do this. So this is a little bit complicated, but hang on. So we had unique sounds, which were sounds that people heard only once. Only once did they hear a dog bark during this encoding or learning session. And then we had repeated sounds, which were sounds they heard many times, such as very similar snippets of birdsong. To make things even more complicated, we had also scenes they only saw once, such as just one picture of a dog, versus scenes they saw very similar types of scenes many times, such as very similar pictures of scenes with trees. And then we combined these 2 dimensions in this experiment. Now, then in the retrieval phase, in the involuntary condition, we did not tell people they participated in a memory experiment. We said, now we want you to conduct a sound location task. It's a very boring task, but still attention demanding. The sounds derived from the encoding from the learning phase, mixed with some novel sounds. We said you should really tell us which side of your head you hear the sound, but if during this process a scene comes to your mind, please indicate that by a button press. For the voluntary recall, we simply presented these sounds and told people that they had to retrieve memories in response to the sounds. Now, back to this complicated picture again. We predicted that unique sounds would be better cues than repeated sounds. So that the best condition, the one that would give us most memories, was with a condition where we had unique sounds paired with unique scenes, because there would be minimal interference. Whereas the two conditions with repeated sounds would be very inefficient for eliciting memories, and the last condition here, where we had unique sounds but repeated scenes, would be sort of in the middle. And that was pretty much what we found. Here's the condition with unique cues and unique scenes, the condition with no cue overload, and that was the one that gave us most involuntary memories, followed by the second one where we had unique cues but repeated scenes. But the two conditions with repeated cues yielded very little memories at all. So, what about the voluntary retrieval? Well, when we plotted the voluntary, this was the involuntary, this is the voluntary on top. You can see it follows pretty much the same pattern. People get more memories when they have to remember, because, of course, they can remember when they get a sound and are told to. This one differs a bit. It seems that people actually voluntarily remember quite a lot to these repeated cues and repeated scenes. But I don't want to go into that. It's not important in this particular context. What is important is that these findings were very robust. They replicated across experiments. And what we can take home from it is that we found that involuntary recall varies systematically as a function of cue item discriminability. So what matters is the distinctiveness of the cue, at least that matters a lot, and also the distinctiveness of the scenes, of the events to be remembered. Now, what is the functionality of this? Well, one important function is that it prevents us from being flooded by involuntary autobiographical memories every moment, because often the current situation will not provide sufficiently distinctive cues. And it also increases the probability of relevance of the memory to the current situation, because past events which have a distinct feature overlap to the current situation are more likely to provide relevant information compared to memories without such overlap. If there is a distinct overlap, then maybe it's relevant. There's no guarantee it is, but it optimizes the probability that it has some relevance carries some important information to the current situation. So, let me now talk a little bit about retrieval effort and introduce the view that involuntary memories provide a very direct access, a shortcut to the personal past. When we are told to retrieve something voluntarily, we start with it can be a verbal request or thought. What did you do last time there was a US election? Then we generate a search description based on our general knowledge about how we maybe generally, what we do generally on election evenings, and try to figure a memory based on that search description. That's what we do when we strategically recall a memory. What is interesting with involuntary memories is that here we have a situational feature of some kind, a trigger of some kind. We have no elaboration of that cue. There's no self-generated search description. The memory is simply discriminated by this situational feature. So we bypass this process where we are elaborating ourselves. Is there any evidence for that? Yes, there is evidence for the fact that involuntary memories are faster, that they're easier. So retrieval time is usually an index for the amount of processing that goes on in our mind. And across many experiments, we have found that, using this paradigm I just described to you, that involuntary memories come to mind more quickly than voluntary memories. And that supports the view that they are easier, that they provide a shortcut. We also have some evidence from brain imaging research. I won't tell you about the details of this experiment, but we were able to, using this picture-sound experiment, to contrast voluntary and involuntary retrieval, and we found that only voluntary strategic retrieval were associated with increased activity in a part of the prefrontal cortex, which we know is typically associated with controlled episodic or autobiographical memory retrieval. The involuntary condition did not show any activity in that area. Whereas a measure we have for an index for having a memory, actually accessing a memory, showed the same areas activated for both types of memories. So both voluntary and involuntary memories shared overlaps in regions known to be associated with successful recollection. But only voluntary retrieval showed this increased activity in the prefrontal cortex. So, in summary, involuntary retrieval is something that is associative and highly context-dependent, involves little effort, and as a consequence of that, it's easy to get, but it's non-selective. You don't decide yourself what you remember. That's the downside. The upside is it involves little effort. It operates through mechanisms of association, which one can argue optimizes functionality, this notion of cue overload that hinders that we are flooded all the time from involuntary memories. It prevents us, as I just said, from being flooded, this principle from being flooded by involuntary memories, and it also increases the probability that there's some relevance between the memory of the memory to the current situation. These processes may become dysfunctional after highly emotional events due to these very same mechanisms, that we don't select the memories, that they come unbidden, that they involve more mood impact and so forth. But that's another lecture. I won't talk about that today. You can get it. So let me just say a little bit by the end here about why it is important to have such a shortcut. And that can be especially important for people or animals, for that matter, who have difficulties with retrieving memories in a controlled fashion, such as non-human animals, young children, people with brain injury, people with depression, older people, and people who suffer from dementia. I won't go through the first three, although we have some data on it, but I will give you some examples about from depression research, aging, and dementia. And first, let me say something about depression. It is well known in the clinical literature that people with depression suffer from overgeneral memories. They have problems retrieving specific episodes. Let me give you an example of that. This is an interview between a therapist and a client. The therapist is trying to get this client, this depressed client, to talk about a specific memory, a memory of a specific event. So he interviews, when you were young, what sort of things made you happy? The patient answers, well, things used to be all right then. I mean, better than they are now, I think. When my dad was there, he used to take me for walks on the common sometimes after lunch on a Sunday. The therapist says, can you tell me about one such walk? The patient answers, well, we used to go out after lunch sometimes. We would take a ball and play around. Afterwards, we might go see my granny, who lived on the other side of the common. He still hasn't told about one specific situation. The therapist tries again. When you think back now, can you remember any particular time? I want you to try and recall any one of these times. It does not have to be particularly important or special, but just give me a damn episode. patient. I remember there used to be other people on the common sometimes, or other children on the common sometimes. Sometimes they would be friends of mine, and I would stop up and chat to them for a while. Can you remember any particular time when you met any of your friends? If it was winter, there weren't usually many people about. So he really has problems getting to a particular memory. Now, some years ago, a postdoc in my center, Lynn Watson, and some UK colleagues and I conducted a study where we used this involuntary autobiographical memory diary with people who were stable depressed, who had a very severe depression, quite severe depression, people who were in the middle, and people who had never been depressed. And as you can see, when we looked at their voluntary memories, the depressed individuals, the very depressed individuals, had substantially fewer specific events. When we looked at their voluntary memories, when they had to retrieve. But when we looked at their involuntary memories, this difference disappeared. Again, consistent with the fact that involuntary memories are a shortcut. It bypasses some of these things that makes it difficult to arrive at a specific event. Same story with aging, actually. We know from literature on aging that voluntary access to specific episodic details deteriorates with aging. Older people have difficulties remember specific episodes. Maybe not as much as this depressed individual, but still. And this is again assumed to be due to reduced executive processes, less efficient search strategies. So therefore we should predict that it's not so bad for involuntary than for voluntary memories. And some years ago, a group of British psychologists studied that, again through this diary method. They looked at specific events for involuntary versus voluntary recall in young and old participants. And when they looked at the voluntary memories, you can see the older participants had fewer specific events. But guess what? When they looked at the involuntary memories, that difference disappeared. Again, consistent with the fact that involuntary memories provide some sort of shortcut to the personal past. What about dementia? Well, we are studying that in collaboration with the Old Town, the Gamleby in Aarhus, where they have a whole apartment built filled with cues for memories from older people's youth. They call it the reminiscence apartment, or erindringslejligheden, where everything is decorated and organized as if it was in the 1950s. And what is the idea behind that? Well, there are two sources, two lines of research that explains that. One is this involuntary, spontaneously arising autobiographical memories I have talked about, and the other is what we know about the lifespan distribution of autobiographical memories in middle-aged and older individuals. So let me say a little bit about that. It is when older people, middle-aged and older people, are looking back at their life, they tend to recall, this is the age at the time of the remembered event, what we see when we plot this kind of data is that there is a dominance of memories from young adulthood. It's called the reminiscence bump. That bump, that reminiscence bump, is also found in people with dementia. These are real data. What I showed you before was just an illustration. So older people with dementia also have best preserved memories from the earlier parts of their life. This is another slide showing the same. See, the dementia also show this dominance of memories from earlier parts of their life. So how, at the same time, they have difficulties retrieving memories. They have difficulties strategically retrieving memories. So how should we try to activate memories in people with dementia? Well, we should, of course, provide highly discriminative cues. We know that from our experiments. And these cues should, of course, match the time. They should speak to the time period from which these individuals' memories are best preserved. So it doesn't help much to give them cues to something that happened yesterday, if the memories they have best preserved are something that happened 30 or 40 years ago. So the ideal, if we want to activate memories in people with dementia, would be, following these ideas, a total immersion into a holistic and historically authentic environment which reconstructs the cultural and material context of these people's youth, and therefore allow memories to be cued along a lot of different modalities, a lot of different sensory modalities, and so forth. And that's exactly what this reminiscence apartment is about. And so in one study we conducted some years ago, we have some ongoing research also, but I'll just present you with some the published data, is we found that when the people with dementia were in the old town setting, compared to an everyday nursing home setting where they did the same things as in the old time setting, they had more autobiographical remembering, they had more detail, they told more detailed memories, and they also had more self-initiated, spontaneous recollections in the old town environment. So, I think I am approaching the end of my talk now, so let me try to sum this up. Involuntary autobiographical memories are frequent in daily life. We know that they operate on the same episodic memory system, or underlying memory system, as voluntary memories do, but involuntary memories involve less effort. They occur automatically in situations where there is a distinct feature overlap with a content of a past event. But it should be a distinct overlap. That's at least when it's most likely to happen. And then I have argued that they provide a shortcut, a cognitive shortcut to the personal past, and that may hold specific advantages for individuals with reduced executive functions, such as individuals with dementia, people with depression, and also may be a help for older, healthy individuals. And with this, I will actually end by quoting Marcel Proust. I showed you in the beginning the picture. He says in his book that it doesn't help to search voluntarily for memories. He says, and so it is with our past. It is labor in vain to attempt to recapture it. All the efforts of our intellect must prove futile. The past is hidden somewhere outside the realm, beyond the reach of the intellect, in some material object, in that sensation that material object will give us, which we do not expect. Thank you very much.
Daughter, what is IAM?
An IAM is an involuntary autobiographical memory, and that is a memory of an event in your past that pops up in your mind without you trying to remember it.
How is that different from any other memory that you have?
It's different because you don't try to remember it, you're not searching for the memory, it arrives unbidden. Often it's triggered by something in the environment, something in your current context that seems to facilitate it.
Is it located in some other place?
Partly. With regard to, that depends on which part of the process we're talking about. If we talk about the first part of the process where we look for memories, then that part is when we compare involuntary memories to memories we try to retrieve, then the memories we try to retrieve show a different pattern of activity than involuntary memories, but they also have overlapping areas in the brain.
Some people claim that old people have fewer IAMs than young people. Is that true?
That doesn't seem to be the case. What seems to be the case is that the older people have difficulties with strategically or voluntarily retrieving autobiographical events, but they seem to have just as many memories that spontaneously pop up in their mind.
What do you think the function of IAMs is?
I think it's very much the same functions as we have for other types of autobiographical memories. They support our identity. They keep us. They help us to have continuity in life. They keep us updated about our where we have been and how we are moving around in the world. And they can also have instrumental functions in relation to problem solving and social functions by supporting relationships.
What is your reason for studying this subject?
Memory is a key phenomenon in our daily lives. Without memory, we were nothing, so to speak. And I believe these involuntary autobiographical memories are a basic mode of remembering the past, and they are very crucial for our ability to function in daily life.